neither behavior is inherently wrong. And so what I did at the time was I made a poll for my users, and I had a large group of users, and I sent out this poll, and I said, what do you guys think?
Welcome to the LabVIEW experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes. I am here today with Hunter Smith of JKI. And Hunter, I first met Hunter at GDevCon this year. I don't think we met before, had we?
No.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of people in the LabVIEW community, and sometimes I forget where I met people, but yeah. So Hunter gave a presentation on UI UX design, and I thought, in my humble opinion, it was one of the best. I can't say the best because then everybody will get out of it, but I could say one of the best because there were a bunch of good presentations there as well. But it spoke to me the most because it got away from like the technical elements and got into like the human side of things. So I feel like at a lot of these conferences, we get so bogged down in the technical details of how to do things, and they're certainly important, but I feel like we miss some of the bigger picture things. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then thanks for saying some kind things about that presentation. After joining JKI, I've had a lot more opportunities to try to share with the community, and so that was a great way to meet a lot of people and start to talk about the things that I care about. And yeah, for the design, I've always found that keeping it user focused is the main thing. In LabVIEW, because making a UI is easy, you kind of get it automatically. A lot of people can just live with that as is, and that's fine a lot of the times. But yeah, one of the things I talked about in the presentation was eyeball hours. And if you have a UI that's going to be up on someone's screen 8 hours a day or 12 hours a day, or it's worth putting some thought into. And so I always kill those extra unneeded decimals. Add good labels, add good UI design, use scale, all those things that the presentation was about telling a story, and it's about being able to look at the UI and get a whole story and not just kind of raw bits of data presented in glorious classic or modern LabVIEW controls.
yeah, well, I was going to ask you a question, but you immediately answered, and that was like, when do you really care about the user interface to put that kind of effort into it, and when is it just like, it's okay as it is? And I think you answered in the sense that like, how much is somebody going to be staring at? And also too, I think part of it is like, who is your audience too? Because I feel like if your audience is another, like if it's a lab program and it's another lab engineer, that's one thing versus if you're selling it to an external customer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's like their impression of your company, then it's also worth putting in the extra energy and effort.
Yeah. Well, and it circles right back to being about the user. I've seen a lot of applications in the LabVIEW world and in other places where the UI designer is designing for the spec, but doesn't sit down with the person who's actually going to be staring at the screen. I don't really, what the engineering manager thinks is not as important as what the technician who's going to be clicking the buttons thinks. And it's amazing sometimes when you walk in the room and you're like, no, he or she needs to be in the meeting with us. They need to talk through it. I want to get their feedback. One of the tricks I've learned is if you take that person and get a list of features and then just pick like a low-hanging fruit and solve it for them, like, can you put the button on the right side instead of the left side? Or you called it a unit and we call it a device. And you're like, cool, no problem. Let me change that. Then you can build that relationship. And so by doing that little like 30-second task, you build that relationship. And then when you come back and you're like, hey, I need someone to sit down and give me an hour of feedback based on all of this stuff. I want to sit down and go through it with you. They're like, absolutely. So that's always a good thing is, do a few of those low hanging fruits that may seem trivial, but, starting the give and take process can build that relationship that in the end makes the UI, follow the use case and follow the need, so that you can kind of prioritize it where it belongs.
Yeah, it helps them see the value in sitting
Yeah.
and talking to you. Because otherwise they're like, oh, you're going to take an hour of my time. And like, am I actually going to see anything out of it? And so, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also too, I find that involving them in the prioritization process is also a big thing too. Like, having those discussions with the client and trying to get the things that are important to them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been interesting tackling that problem now that I'm in the consulting world, where a lot of my time is about billing hours, and you're like, okay, I want to design a UI. I think doing it the right way will take 2 weeks, and they're like, what can you do in 1 week? And you're like, okay, and like it's not going to be as nice. There are going to be some raw edges, like and trying and setting that expectation that, like, all right, we'll start with this, and I'm not going to put that extra week in that makes it takes it from a minimum viable product to a minimum likable product. But and those are terms I've started to adopt: MVP for viable, likable MLP, or lovable's the highest on the list there. But yeah, building that out so that you can set that expectation and say, like, okay, this is a quick and dirty UI, and we're not going to think about user stories, or no, we're going to sit down and plan this out and make sure we're getting everyone's feedback, and because that all takes time.
Yeah. No, but I
I
think
definitely have erred on the overboard because it's something I'm passionate about, and so I often have to kind of check myself and be like, nope, no, this is fine for what we need.
yeah, I think it's managing expectations. I think is something you hit on. I think is really important, and also understanding what their expectations are too, as far as like what's good enough, right? And if you've reached the point that's good enough, then maybe it's okay to just stop there and be like,
Yeah.
yeah,
I had an engineering professor in college who always said engineering is the science of good enough. The scientists care about that 12th decimal, like pi is 3 gets me 85% of where I need to be. And so engineering is about making it good enough to get the job done. And yeah, overdoing it means you're over engineering, and that's often a bad thing, but not always.
Well, I had a math professor when I went for my master's degree who would always say, like, yeah, if we were engineers, we would just stop here. He's like, but we're gonna go prove it out to like the millionth decimal place. And I was like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
it's fine, go do that if that's what you want. But yeah, there definitely is a practical side to things. I'm noticing an interesting thread though, because you mentioned, we were talking about things to talk about, and one of them was documentation and the LabVIEW style. But when you said user focused as far as the UX, I think documentation and the LabVIEW style are both actually done best when they have that user focus too, right? Like if you start
Sure.
user, that's like a surefire way to get those things right.
Yeah, well, and there's two kinds of documentation. You have user documentation and developer documentation, and sometimes that's the same people, and sometimes it's not. I agree. Style's job is to become the code documentation, and when it's done right, it is fairly self-documenting and fairly well explained. I like to think of the idiom that you're not. We like to think we're writing code for the compiler, like I'm optimizing machine code direct registry access because I have that power. And it's like, no, 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 you're writing this for the next developer. Unless you're in some, there's very, very few cases in an application where like making something difficult to read for a performance trade is worth it. If your setup takes an extra millisecond, but it's way more readable, then like that's a win. Now, sometimes you're inside of that nested loop, and like you can make it efficient, but there you have to make up clever code with documentation. Clever code is when it's like, oh, I see what you did there. You're using some bit shifts, or you're trying to be clever with a NOR or a NAND or something. And you can always do clever things, but when you do those things, you have to leave the documentation so that the next person can decode your cleverness and find it, easy to move on.
Yeah, that's one of those things. Like there is a movement of people who, especially like clean code people, who are like, oh, all documentation is a code spell and all this stuff. But like, yeah, documenting something that's obvious from the code, yeah, that's like a waste. But documenting those, like the why behind the decision making behind why am I using this and here? Because it's obvious to see, oh, I'm anding these two things together, but why did I put that there? Or why
Yeah.
am I shifting 2 bits? Right? Oh, because shifting by 2 bits multiplies by 4 or whatever. Yeah.
Well, and so I'll give you a very simple example. You can do a rising edge detection by doing a greater than on a Boolean in a shift register.
Yep.
So if a true, true is greater than false, and false being my last iteration, I can get a rising edge. But like, if that's not something you've done before, the first time you look at it, you're like, wait, a Boolean is greater than? Like what? But if you just put a note that says Boolean greater than is the same as a rising edge, then it's like, oh, okay, gotcha. And so that one little comment can save someone a bunch of time, trying to fix your bug. And it's like, no, that was fine. It
Yeah.
was just clever.
Yeah, well, that's also too where like maybe good naming, like if you put it in a little sub VI and just say rising edge,
Sure.
right? And then okay, I
Mhm.
open it up and I see this forwarding, and then maybe I have to think about how's it doing that. But if I'm reading the greater code, I don't care how it's doing it. It's
Yeah.
edge detector, right?
But yeah, and then we all have to kind of pick and choose our battles within the LabVIEW documentation. For instance, I almost never write VI descriptions.
Really?
Maybe if I'm publishing an API, I'm gonna like make a package of reusable. But if I'm writing a package that I and one other developer on my team is gonna use, I try to write the VI's naming to be, step.delete, step.add, and I really like name.verb. That's my latest trend that I'm sure I'll reverse on in a few months. But yeah, and if you make step.add and you have a little icon that looks like adding a step, then like, do I need a VI description that says this adds a step into your sequence, or and so you have to pick and choose that. But yeah, I put a lot of stock in icons. I make graphic icons for most of my stuff, including type defs, which I know a lot of people don't really do. But yeah, but I don't do VI description. So I pick and choose where I do that, and I'm always like, how do you prioritize
Well, that's very
how you
interesting
document it?
because you're making me think because my initial reaction was, oh, I always do that. But I'm like you in that I do that on things that I think are going to get reused elsewhere. But like I find I write a lot of object oriented code and like there's a lot of getters and setters and stuff, and it's really annoying. Like VI analyzer, I run it, it says you don't have a description for this get or set or read or write, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, because it's obvious what it's doing. And like why would I possibly yeah.
Yeah. Well, so that actually ties into something I've been working on, a little pet project. So um, at JKI, we've been investing a lot recently into developer tools and making that world less painful. And so one of the things I'm working on is something right now I'm calling the crawler, but it's a static analysis tool at its core, kind of similar to VI Analyzer, but VI Analyzer will say, hey, you don't have a description. Crawler I have now set up, it'll say, hey, you don't have a description, and oh, by the way, I recognize this is a simple accessor. I'm just going to add a description that says, sets the step name property. And so, you can write, it's a plugin framework, so you can write rules. I can have is my block diagram striped into gray, white, which is something I really like doing, or, does my name use spaces? And I can have a bunch of checks. And then a lot of the rules that we're writing can be automatically fixed. And so it's really satisfying when you can, you write a whole project or maybe a class and you're like, oh, actually, I want all these to be reentrant. And you can just add that rule, automatically set it. And then our goal is to get it so I then run that same check in CI once I commit my code. And so then I can make sure, keeps us all honest, makes it, if you make the description automatic, then like, sure. But I don't want to have to do it if it's silly. And I don't want to have to update it and forget about it if I decide to change it from step to object, and like now I have to go refactor those and manually check them. So I'm trying to make those things easy so that a lot of the documentation is built in. And if you structure your code well, the documentation just kind of comes out of that.
Yeah, Laura and I had this conversation not that long ago, actually, and yeah, it was on the same thing because I had discovered Python that has this auto formatter called Black, which you may be familiar with.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, this seems great because like I liked it from the point of view of you get a lot of noise sometimes in your diffs, right? Because like you change the what frame of a case structure is visible, and now all of a sudden you accidentally save it, and now it's a different VI, and you're
Yep.
right. Whereas if you had something that like every time you saved a VI, it could intervene and just reset that, then if you had case one visible and you accidentally saved it, hey, it went back to case zero, and everybody's happy, and now there's no diff.
All right, I'm adding a discard trivial changes rule in for the crawler. Because
Yeah,
yeah, there's a lot of trivial changes that if I have an option to discard before I make, especially if I'm using Git and I don't want a super noisy commit. Uh, yeah, I think we can add that rule.
yeah. Because noisy commits are really a problem because like if you don't do save all in LabVIEW, then you end up forgetting to save stuff. So you get in the habit of clicking save all, but then you end up with 20 VIs that changed, and you
Hmm.
go through the thing, and sometimes the diff tool doesn't even find the change.
Yeah.
Like yeah, it's like yeah.
Well, and there's so much mysterious under the hood. You'll see some of the changes in the class XML, and every now and then get arrogant enough to be like, I'm gonna go in and do some XML surgery and fix something, and sometimes it works. Uh,
Yeah.
have you done much XML surgery on classes or gotten
No,
too
I've
clever in
I've
there?
managed to avoid it. I tend to work mostly alone, so that doesn't happen to me very often. But yeah,
Sure.
I have thought that like having a diff or merge tool for classes would be and libraries. I don't know how like there's so many things that are standard in other languages that I don't know how NI has gotten away without doing them.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's one of my pet peeves.
Well, and
Yeah,
that's why. So JKI just announced at GDevCon we're expanding our relationship with NI. Obviously we've been working on VI Package Manager for a long time. Now that's included and ships with LabVIEW, and we're going to continue to work on that package stuff. But a lot of these kind of pain points are areas that JKI really wants to invest in and see if we can, create the tools that kind of go alongside of LabVIEW, that solve those pain points, and especially for the professional developer, for the developer who's using it every day, maybe a couple different versions with a lot of different sets and
yeah.
qualities and rules, and the life of the consulting LabVIEW developer means I'm jumping code bases a couple times a day, and trying to keep track of all that's always a challenge.
I think it's actually a good time to approach NI with that because their motto used to be programming optional, and now they've changed their business units and all this stuff, and they're pursuing all these big clients. And I think they're discovering that these big clients are far more interested in the software engineering side of things than their previous. When they were targeting people like an individual in a lab, the level of software engineering skill and tools that they need is very different than somebody at SpaceX or Blue Origin or whatever big companies they're targeting now.
Yeah. Well, and the NI customer base is really successful when everything's you know built into a single ecosystem. If I'm using NI hardware and NI drivers and NI and LabVIEW, and System Link and VI Package Manager, and these things that are really well tested together, you can be really successful. In other languages, if you're using Python, you end up having to do a little bit of everything. You have a Python, but you have to have some PowerShell script and a Bash script and some YAML files. And because a lot of the LabVIEW customers and the NI customers are really successful in that silo, you have to make it work kind of natively.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're working on. And hopefully things like crawler and then Karaya tester and all of those things can kind of come together in a way that makes it a lot more streamlined experience for that LabVIEW customer who's used to the
Yeah.
mainlined experience.
Yeah, the one thing I really want to see and I do, and I want to see more of in LabVIEW is that refactoring tools. I feel like the refactoring tools, particularly around classes, I
So like, what do you
feel
mean
like
refactoring? What kind of refactoring are you
like
thinking of?
renaming classes. Like you want to rename a class, okay, you can rename the class file, but then it's in a folder that's got the same name of the class. So you got to move it, and then you got to find every class icon or class, object on the
Yep.
front panel that has the class name in it and rename it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like, yeah, like some of us have written little tools to do that, but like everybody's written that tool. It's all over the place, and there's no standardization. Like,
And all the tools we write do some of it.
yeah, and it does some little different things. Yeah, and like even like actor framework. I had an actor framework project where I wanted to rename a message. That was even worse because it's tied to the name of the method, and you have to change like 10 different things, and it's so like that type of stuff. Like the other one that drives me nuts is like if I have a class, I ought to be able to click on that class and highlight 3 or 4 methods and say, give me an interface that just implements those methods.
Sure.
Yeah, do that. Like if I have a class that has 10 methods and I want an interface that does all 10 of those methods, I have to create that separately. I have to create all those. I have to make sure all the connector panes and all the VI settings match for the reentrancy and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
then I have to set the inheritance, and then it works.
Yeah.
Whereas like in other languages and other IDEs, that's like one click.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of those problems I think I'm solving with crawler. So for instance, like I can load a whole project in, and then like let's say I want to change the settings for uh, all of the overrides for a single method. I
Yep.
can go through and search and say find all the step delete, and then I can modify 6 VIs at once based on a naming
Yep.
uh, convention. But yeah, those tools are very ad hoc. I have one that I use that will, if you're using the top left and right for your class in and class out, and it's a class member, it will rename those to match the class icon,
Yep.
which is nice. But yeah, it's still 5 or 6 steps to rename a class, and it's easy to forget some of them, and then you end up with abandoned VIs and
Yeah.
things that just don't match.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the other thing actually too. Like in LabVIEW, there's this. I end up with this weird thing where sometimes, like on big projects, particularly long-lived ones, I end up with abandoned VIs that just like because I've removed them from the project, but they're
Mm-hmm.
still on disk somewhere, and I forget
Mm-hmm.
to delete them, and like, and next thing you know, you're like, what? Where did this thing come from? And
Mm-hmm.
it'd be nice to have some sort of tool that would like detect that and just be like, hey, like
We built it. We built it
where's the
into
project?
crawler.
Yeah, the project doesn't reference these files, and maybe that's intentional because you're loading them dynamically or something, but you should at least be aware of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, so I just made that tool for crawler. It'll find any orphans. So yeah, VIs that don't have any callers, and then I want to add config so that you can put some on the expected list. That if you
Yeah,
are,
yeah,
it is
exactly.
pure
Yeah, like the
dynamic.
plugins folder. Don't worry about that one or
But
something
then
like
there
that.
are easy cases when like the member still claims to be part of the class, but the class doesn't claim any ownership.
Yeah, yeah. That's the other thing too. Like delete, like that drives me nuts too. Because I like add something to the class or remove something from it, and I'll save the VI, but I forget to save the class. And like locally, I run my tests locally, everything works, and then I go to
Hmm.
push, and the CI fails, and it's like, and I'm like, wait, what? And yeah.
Yeah. I've started using Derek Bomarito's. He made an IDE uh, package.
Oh,
One of the things it does, let's say I make a new child class and I want to do 4 override methods. Normally, if you do that, it pops open all 4 VIs, and then it makes you save each one. And it's like,
yeah.
it's an override. I already know where and what I want to call it. So he added a little hack. So now when you create your overrides, they just boom appear in your folder, saved in place.
Yeah, and then you
So
open up one at a time and implement them as you want or whatever. Yeah.
yeah. So like that was nice to find. But it's always a challenge to find those tools, and there's some floating out there, and of course, most of us have ones we've written ourselves, and the barrier to share is always just like it takes a little work to make it easily shareable.
Well, there's another challenge too because the ones that aren't easily showable, the one that you like find somewhere on a forum, if you're not careful, you install that on your IDE, great, and then you start a new project and you create a new VM, and now all those tools are gone, and then you got to
Hmm.
remember where you found it, or you got to drag it from the previous one, and
Hmm.
yeah, that whole the Laura and I had this conversation too, like the setting up a LabVIEW environment could and should be much better. So yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely stay tuned. Jim's talked a lot about Dragon, and the things we're doing there to really make setting up a new LabVIEW system, or even we're longer term we want to do virtualized environments, so that we can follow what a lot of the other languages are doing, and we've all made the mistake of if you install one wrong driver or piece of software, you can kind of blow up a LabVIEW machine,
Yep.
um, uh, and make it so you basically have to format to get back to where you want to be. When I was in AE, back when AE was phone support, working the LabVIEW phones, it's always interesting when you had to bust out that the secret KB that they had for nuking all NI software on a machine. Though it even that secret recipe wasn't 100%.
Yeah, I don't know that I've encountered that, but I've definitely encountered like the max database corruption thing, and that was like a
Yeah.
huge problem. And like
Hmm.
uninstall all this huge list of stuff and then reinstall. And also the order you install stuff apparently matters in some cases, at least in older systems. It
Yeah.
definitely.
No, the NI is fixing that. So now drivers aren't compiled into specific versions of LabVIEW. So you could just install DACMX and it'll work with, all the versions of LabVIEW you have. I think that was 22 and later.
Yeah, yeah, I'd heard that. Yeah. So yeah, they've changed in the past like several years. They've changed the way they distribute stuff because they went to the new NIPM
Hmm.
model. And then they also like now they're with this whole subscription thing, they're on the like 2022 Q1, Q3, whatever
Hmm.
model. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. But I'm gonna assume it's a step in the right direction and it's better. So I mean, I'm sure there's some
Yeah.
growing, but once we get through those, I think it'll be a good thing.
Well, and now that JKI is really getting more involved with packaging and taking some long-term projects, in collaboration with NI, I think we'll have a lot of great chances just to make it really streamlined. And at least the people doing it are, at JKI, we know all the pain points. We've felt them all.
I was about to say I'm very glad you guys are involved because I think that a lot of the problems that stem from some of the stuff that NI does is that the people writing the code aren't necessarily LabVIEW developers. They're C sharp or whatever LabVIEW's written in C++, and
Mm-hmm.
they understand that side of it and they understand what's going on behind the scenes, but they don't necessarily really understand how it's used. So
Yeah, and yeah, our entire development team at JKI are all CLAs and have come from it. We went to a customer meeting the other day and did the round table where everyone listed their background, and but we have a PhD in chemistry, and Laura with her experience with Westinghouse and aerospace companies, and we have a pretty great team at JKI, and I've had a good time working with them over the last year.
yeah, no, there's a lot of variety there. Hi, it's your host, Sam Taggart. I'm hosting a free webinar on May 9th titled Beyond NI Training, What You Really Need to Know to Be Effective in LabVIEW. I believe that NI training is necessary but not sufficient. In this webinar, I will point out how to take advantage of what NI offers, as well as how to identify the additional skills that you need in order to be effective with LabVIEW, and where to learn those skills. I hope you will join me there. Find the link to register for my free webinar in the show notes. Yeah. So one of the other things you wanted to talk about was maps and interfaces. I think those are interesting topics.
Yeah, so for a long time, I was working on projects kind of exclusively in older versions of LabVIEW. I was working in LabVIEW 2015, you know, for most of the last decade, and so didn't really get to play with maps until recently. And then, now at JKI, of course, work in a lot of different versions of LabVIEW. And before, I used a lot of variant lookup tables, and it always felt like a kind of clever hack. And finding the pain points of uh, with a map or a variant lookup table, you're usually paying an upfront penalty to load it. It's going to be a little slower to load it, but hopefully at runtime, if you're just accessing the map or variant lookup table, it's very performant. And yeah, like I recently, when I was writing the crawler, I found something that was like, oh, it was a map of maps, and then that gets into another map, and you're like, oh no, I may be going too far here. Um, but yeah, it was definitely a hole that was missing in LabVIEW, and you know, I'm building a lot of stuff on top of it now.
Yeah, I learned how to use maps when I learned Python. Python uses maps, or what they
Hmm.
call them dictionaries, but
Sure.
quite a bit. And yeah, just going through some Python exercises and just seeing some of the cool stuff that you can do,
Hmm.
it is quite impressive.
I really enjoyed Alan Smith's presentation that he did. I think at both GDev cons, the maps and classes and objects where he mixes them all together
Yep.
to create like a tag-based object search system that was really great. And I think I've rewatched that video 2 or 3 times to steal little ideas from that. So that definitely opened me up to even, because now you're layering sets on top of maps and then putting those inside of objects, and it comes back to, is everything labeled well? Uh, is everything, are all your keys and values labeled well? And then if they are, it's a really nice system.
Yeah. Yeah, another way that I like to practice all that stuff is if you ever do the Advent of Code challenges, those make a lot of use. I mean, most of the problems you can probably solve without that, but if you know sets and maps, it makes it
Sure.
and sets are actually very interesting. Like doing like intersections and unions and stuff can be very, very useful. Um, I feel like as LabVIEW developers, we tend, I think mostly just because we didn't have them until recently, think we tend
Yeah.
not to do those things.
Well, and so much of LabVIEW project data is about, just a stream, the big array, the big 2D array, the waveform. and when you start to, those don't work as well. And usually when I'm making things for maps and sets, it's often driven by user interfaces, because I have some giant set of data and I want to be able to slice it and filter it and dissect it, and a lot of times that is driven by the UI, because that's what, because yeah, otherwise a lot of LabVIEW applications that exist out in the world, once they make the TDM file, like that's all they need to do with the data.
Yeah.
um,
So I have a very interesting question for you, because I've been reading this book called Secure by Design, and it
mhm,
talks about like domain-driven design and security. And one of the things it advocates for, because you mentioned like just storing stuff as strings, it advocates for like instead of just passing around a string as like a telephone number, like having an object or some sort of type that then when you create it, it does the type checking for you, right? And then it's safe. Like if the type checking checks to make sure it's got 7 digits and no extraneous stuff, then saving it to a database or whatever, you don't have to worry about SQL injection or any of that stuff because it's already been sanitized and you
mhm.
can only do certain things with it. And I wonder what you think about that, because like in LabVIEW, I often so I've kind of actually almost gone the other way in that I like simple types like crossing library boundaries and stuff, so that I don't get this like weird cross linking or dependency stuff going on. Not cross linking, but
Sure,
dependencies, right? Because if this library passes out a string, then anything that uses it, okay. But if it passes out some other object type, then anything that uses it is then dependent on that same object type, and it gets
sure.
messy.
No, I generally don't let maps go across API boundaries. Generally, when I have a map, I have a item manager, and I create the item manager and I say, here's all the items I want you to create, and then it stores all those items in a big map, and those don't leave the item manager, object. But that gives me the access to say, hey, let me go read a random item or delete a random item or add a random item, and have full control of that. But yeah, so let's say I then want to take my item manager and I want to display all my items in a multi-column list box. Let's use some classic OOP examples of a animal. So I have a dog class and a cat class, and they have how many legs they have and all that. And I want to display it in a table. And it's like I could create this interface where I ask my pet manager and it gives me all my pet objects, and then each one displays in, but then now like everything has to be aware of everything, so I'll just make a pet.print class that prints out a bunch of strings, and then
Okay.
if you want to display it in a multi-column list box or just in strings, or you want to dump it to disk, like everything speaks string. But that's not performant. That's like a data representation and not a data, I'm not going to store it as string. But yeah, I'll let that last step always be string. And then the linkage between my UI and my class. Now, if I add 6 more properties to my pet because it's just printing a table, it can do that and I don't have to change my
You
caller.
ever think about instead of raw strings using JSON? Like
Yeah,
that would actually be very useful, right? Because then I'm not dependent on like, oh, is it index? If it's a CSV list, like which index is it or whatever. They all have names, and it's
yeah.
yeah,
No, I actually was working on a project today that did that. But I have some giant JSON dictionary, and one of the items in that is an array. I can load it in and then still display it in a table. So it's JSON's a little hard on the eyes sometimes,
yeah.
especially for larger and more complex structures. And so you can store that. In that case, you can actually store your data as JSON, but then display it in a table. And then when I say delete an item, in the UI, it just looks like my row disappeared, but in the back end, I'm deleting a whole object and a whole tree underneath that object.
Cool. Yeah, anytime
Yeah.
I do like any kind of list box or tree structure, I always have the data structure in the background, and then I have like an update table method. And then the thing just like operates on the data structure, and then the data structure just redraws the table or refills the
Hmm.
table, because that's the only way to stay sane doing that I've found, because otherwise it's like stuff gets out of sync and it's really hard. And yeah. um
Well, then you have to decide if you want to make your UI updater an asynchronous daemon. At a certain point, you're like, oof, that, maybe I want to add 6 lines, and while that's happening, also try to be updating in the background. And so recently I've been creating a lot of little asynchronous daemons just to handle one loop or one list box or one table.
uh,
And that way you can just fire events at it, and then it'll update when it gets
yeah.
around to it.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, though. You mentioned like having like a collection manager or something, and I read something interesting. I think it was Martin Fowler or something was saying that like anytime you make a collection of any kind, whether it's an array or a list or a map or a set, that you should almost always wrap it in a class, because like the underlying things may change. Like you may have something
Hmm.
that initially everything's unique, but then maybe later you care about different properties, or like you care about the order. And so if you make it a class, then you can manipulate that later and have more control. I thought that
Yeah.
was interesting.
Yeah,
But
Tom McQuillan is on the JKI team now, and he recently gave an internal presentation that I think he had presented publicly about a lot of the OOP Gang of Four design patterns.
yep,
Um, I
Tom,
think you worked on that with him, didn't
yeah,
you?
Tom and I have
uh,
talked about that a lot. Yeah.
so yeah, he was showing us the proxy pattern,
Yep.
and the manager is a great use of the proxy pattern, where I'm not going to just give out my whole array to anyone who asks, but if you ask nicely and have the right key, I'll give you exactly what you want. And if you do that well, it can get good security, and you just can't go overboard, and then you end up calling through 6 classes to get through anything.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like, how do you balance that with the added complexity? Like, what is, because obviously every time you add a wrapper, you're adding some level of complexity. So, like, when is it worth it to? How do you decide when it's worth it to add that extra complexity versus when it's better to keep it simple and make it easy to understand?
Since joining JKI, I've gotten a lot more into UML for making those decisions. And so, we'll mock up a little quick UML, and sometimes I write the code and then make the UML, and sometimes I write the UML and then make the code. And if I've chosen a bad architecture, when I'm writing the UML, I'll be like, why are there 3 layers here? That seems like there's nothing, this layer is not doing anything, or this abstraction is pointless. And so I do use that, and I've created some pretty oppressive UML diagrams where you're like, okay, there's a lot going on here. And basically, you can do rubber duck programming, or I can try to explain it to one of my teammates and say, like, okay, here's why all these classes exist. And if I can't do that without feeling bad about it, or without apologizing, like, I know this is ridiculous, then like, and usually when I see that the UML is too complex, I'll clean up the UML with like the right words. Is it called an item manager? Is it because okay, it's an item manager. What is it responsible for? It manages the items. What kind of interface does it have? You can ask it for addresses, or you define those vocab terms, and then the design is much more straightforward. And then if you got it right, when I then go to refactor my code, like, suddenly the interface is like one string between these 2 classes, or like, when the interfaces between the objects suddenly get really clean, and like, yep, the item manager, you give it a key and you get out an item, that's exactly what I want, then like, you're zooming in.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a good point. Like the API between different things gives you an idea of the complexity. Like if the API is complex, like that complexity should probably belong in one or the other of the
Hmm.
objects,
Hmm.
right?
Well, and I always appreciate, you've been posting a lot on LinkedIn recently about solid design, and thinking about that. Complexity is fine as long as it's encapsulated, and when it is well encapsulated and has its good single responsibility, then it's testable. And then it's extensible, because I can write some crazy complex algorithm. I can test it without having to run my whole application, and I can hand it to you. You can then use it without really needing to understand what it's doing. And when solid's done right, that's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, yeah. Solid's one of those interesting topics. Like I feel like my initial reaction is kind of negative because I feel like it's overused, but I think there's some good stuff there. I think it's just like one of those things that's like misapplied, I think is
Yeah,
part. And I think that's the problem with a lot of stuff in software, right? A lot of things get bad names like agile, DevOps, all these things. If you misapply them, then people are like, "Oh, I don't want that." But yeah, that's
yeah.
not really that's a misapplication of the underlying principles.
Well, and like all software engineering, you pick and choose the parts that resonate to you. But single responsibility is probably the one I think about the most in solid, of just like, give it a good name. It's the item manager. What does it do? It manages items. And if you can get that level right, then like, you
Yeah.
have a hope of getting all the other pieces talking with the right
Yeah, and
API.
I think you avoid overcomplicating things, and that abstraction is a good abstraction because it's easy to understand without like
Hmm.
looking at the details, right? I think the problem
Hmm.
is when the abstraction is so abstract that you're like, I don't really know what's going on. I need to look at the details, and once you start looking at the details, then you end up diving deep, and yeah,
Yeah.
interesting stuff. So yeah, you mentioned LinkedIn. You sparked some uh, discussion the other day.
Yeah, no, so because Tom and I are working on some projects related to the DevOps life cycle and CI/CD and a bunch of tools around this space. We really wanted to hear from other people because we have a fairly diverse background of experience at JKI. I think we have a reasonable cross section, but we can't know as much as our friends do. And so it was really interesting to see the things that resonated. And in the end, I think most of the things that we saw people complaining about. So yeah, the post was, what are your LabVIEW pain points? What are the parts that give you the most friction? And people talked about crashes and project management and package management and stuff that we all know, and stuff that sometimes is frustrating of like, no one has solved this yet. Like, but yeah, so we're working on solving parts of it.
What was the most surprising thing that you saw on that list? Was there anything that like jumped out? I was like, wow, I didn't really think about that.
Honestly, there wasn't anything surprising. There were things that weren't already on my list. I wasn't thinking a lot about crashes, and I think, knock on wood, I haven't been dealing with a lot of LabVIEW crashes recently. Knock more on wood. But we've all been in those cycles when like all you're dealing with LabVIEW crashes, and like I don't think JK is not going to make a LabVIEW crash preventer or a LabVIEW crash solver. But maybe we can log crashes or give you views, or some of the things. Sometimes it's like, oh, you have a corrupted type def, and like if you know where to look, that's easy. And so maybe we can get 3 of the top 10 that we can at least point some tea leaves on. Yeah, that one's that sentence I just said, it's probably about as much thought as we put into it. But that was something that like I wasn't thinking about at the time, but then it was like, oh yeah, that is a major problem, and I think there are some things that we could help with there.
To NI's credit, that has gotten a lot better. I
Yeah,
remember dealing with insane objects and looking into the heap and stuff. I haven't done that in like 10 years
yeah,
probably.
no, me
I
too.
had to. Yeah.
And I will always give credit to NI's auto recover. Like it almost never fails me. And when it does crash, or even if I kill a VM or a blue screen happens, like next time you restart LabVIEW, it usually picks up the pieces, and you've only lost the last 6 clicks or something.
Okay, so I have a question. So you mentioned DevOps earlier, and this was one of those terms that I had heard talked about a whole lot, and it took me a long time to wrap my head around what it is. And I'm not even still sure I understand the whole breadth of it, but can you give the listeners like an explanation of like what is DevOps when it comes to LabVIEW from your point of view?
Sure. So I'll acknowledge DevOps is a loaded term because it means so many different things to so many different people. If I asked, everyone has heard the term or vaguely familiar with it, but to one person it just means unit testing, and for one person it means requirements tracking, and for another person it's all about Jira, and another person it's just about when you do code reviews. And so I define DevOps as the activities that you have to do to take something from idea to delivered product, and really focusing on less on the idea side, because a lot of DevOps tools out there are focused around do the idea and have your Kanban board and schedule that, and it's like I don't think that's not unique to LabVIEW. That works about the same as it does for other software. But once you get to, okay, I have a LabVIEW repo. It's a bunch of VIs and some classes and some controls and an XML file and a YAML file. And in the end, I need to have delivered code, an executable running on my customer's machine or running on this deployed system. And so like, okay, what are the things? So the big ones are unit testing. So whether it's something like Cry or VI Tester, how do I make sure my code actually does what I want it to be? So a good DevOps suite will have unit testing. It's automatic builds. So
Mhm.
being able to automatically build your products. And we've all had builds that, it's a 6-hour LabVIEW build, and I'm not going to do that after every commit, but I can get CI to do that for me. And so if I'm testing and building, and then hopefully doing some kind of release management, and whether that's through something like GitHub, where you can create releases, through the GitHub repo, or whether it's through something like you're uploading VI packages to S3 and making them available to customers to download. Those are all steps. But through that post on LinkedIn and through asking people, it's it's managing crashes, it's crawling the code and auditing the code and doing style checks and doing code reviews. Um, so I, you know, all I'd say it's so many things to so many people, and so because it is overloaded, I kind of don't like using DevOps, and sometimes I'll talk about LabVIEW software management because I
Yeah.
think that's a little more scoped. It's like, how do you manage code? There's lots of tools that how to write code, but once you have the code, like, how do you make sure it works consistently, it tests, you can modify it without fearing the world, and in the end, are you spending human hours on that, or are you creating systems to build that in?
So it's about automating those processes, kind of. Is that like a part of it?
I think that's an important part of it, but I think you can have totally manual DevOps and still have a successful system. You know, if I manually test my code, I don't need a GitHub to run it for me, but like it's easy. I click one thing and it runs, and I
Yeah.
get a nice report out. And it's not like, oh, you got to remember to go open these 12 places and run these 6 things. And
Yeah, it's
so, you
about
know,
having a process that's
hmm
repeatable, right? Yeah.
hmm
Yeah,
and
I
yeah,
get.
and repeatable, whether a person is clicking it or GitHub is telling you someone pushed to the repo, or you build every day at 2 a.m. All of those processes should do the same steps, and it's about making those steps easy and repeatable.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Yeah, I get what you say about using overloaded terms. Like I stopped using the term agile a long time ago because yeah, I just talk about iterative development, and that seems to be a little bit less of a lightning rod.
hmm
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting when you're talking to somebody and like you're talking about a term and you mean one thing and they mean something else, and there's definitely some clashing. And yeah,
Getting the vocabulary right,
yeah,
matters.
yeah,
And if I'm ever having to present like something, you got to start by defining a term like that if you're going to use it.
yeah. And some people, it does start like religious wars too, where some people are like, I must mean this, and and you're like, so
Yeah, like I don't I'm not interested in the UI versus UX. What's UI versus what's UX. Like I don't care
yeah, yeah,
from a
yeah.
semantics point of view.
Yeah, yeah, so, yeah. I don't know. I feel like some of those like distinctions, if you're really deep in that space, it might make sense to make those distinctions. But
Sure.
from the outside, if you're not a
Yeah.
UX expert, they look the same.
Sure. Well, and I'll argue all day on how to apply it.
Yeah,
But what to call it is less important.
yeah, yeah. No, definitely. All right. Well, it's been a great conversation. I very much enjoyed it. I think we hit a lot of important topics. Is there anything else that you want to talk about that we have not talked about yet?
Well, so you mentioned you wanted to ask about a LabVIEW experiment
Yeah, that
I've
was going to be
done.
my next question. So yeah, we can
All
just.
right, perfect segue. So I was thinking about it, and I had a good one. It's uh, LabVIEW tangent, but not directly a coding experiment. So I was working on a user interface for a large group of users, and we had to decide the behavior when you click into a numeric control. Does it place the cursor, and then you can go left and right or up or down and change the number, or when you click in, does it highlight the whole number, and then when you start typing, it replaces it? So, like a URL bar in Chrome, if I go up to my URL and I click it, as soon as it clicks, it highlights the whole thing. And when I type Google, as soon as I hit the G, it only says G. And so in like a number line, I can click that and replace that. Now, a lot of times that's a great behavior because then, especially for new numbers, let's say I want to set it to 400, I click, I type 400, enter, it's right there. It's less likely that I'll accidentally type 4000. But on the other hand, if it's 2375 and I want to change it to 2374, it's really nice if you can click into it and then use the up and down arrow keys and the built-in LabVIEW functionality
Mhm.
to do that. And in the end, neither one is wrong. Neither behavior is inherently wrong. And so what I did at the time was I made a poll for my users, and I had a large group of users, and I sent out this poll, and I said, what do you guys think? And didn't frame it well, just said like, I want to get this right, and I want to know what you think. And it came back pretty evenly divided, which to me said like, there's not, if it was 90 one way or the other, I just said, cool, we'll do that. But because it was evenly divided, like I just decided I did the one I liked the most, and argued in my head was safest, and then was like, hey, here's what we made, thanks for your input, and made two mistakes. One is I didn't realize at the time, I didn't think about the second shift operators. and I had only sent this poll out in the morning, so half the users were then already upset that their feedback wasn't acknowledged. And two, I framed it as a democratic process. Uh, there's a scene in the movie Sunshine. It's a Danny Boyle movie about a team of astronauts that has to launch a spaceship to the sun, and they have this whole scene where they're arguing about like, oh, should we do this risky move? And they're like, no, no, this isn't a democracy. We're engineers. The person most qualified to make the decision is going to make it. Um, and so the things I learned from the mistake of like is be sure you know which users you want to listen to and you're not forgetting someone. And two, be sure you set the expectation that you're like, I think this is the way we should do it. I want to gut check and make sure that's not overwhelmingly wrong, and not frame things as democracy, because you cannot design good code by committee. You can't design it by voting. And so after that, I did a lot less widespread polls and more focused on building relationships with a couple of key operators that I really trusted and that I felt like could represent a lot of people, that like they, that I wasn't going to betray the masses. But in the end, you have to develop a couple of these key contacts, because you can't get everybody's opinion, especially when it comes down to stuff that is just a matter of opinion.
Yeah, well, also too, it brings me to this thought that like not all users are necessarily equal in the sense that like some of the users might be casual users and some might be power users. And if you piss off your casual users, that's one thing. If you piss off your power users, that's a whole different problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, and
I
also like
always found that when I taught LabVIEW classes for NI, when you're first, someone who's just opening a block diagram for the first time, they would get really confused by the auto tool. And so I found that people who grew up playing real-time strategy games, your Warcraft, Starcraft games, because those have an auto tool, they picked up auto tool no problem. The mouse does different things depending on where you click. But people who'd never played those games, like they couldn't do it. And so it's like, figuring out where those borders are. Like, who in here has played Starcraft? Like, okay, you guys auto tool, you guys, let's have a separate chat and we'll talk about this tool.
yeah, auto tool's an interesting one because I was a holdout for a long time because I learned from a guy who learned LabVIEW before they had it, and he was very much against it, and I was tabbing for the longest time. And then I started using it. I was like, oh, this is great. And then they went to the high resolution screens, and I'm not as big a fan now because it's so hard. Like I still use it, but it's so hard to get the right pixel, and it drives me nuts sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially with like I mostly use NXT style controls, and
Mhm.
like that 1 pixel cluster border,
Oh yeah.
trying to snipe that just right is tricky sometimes.
Yeah, and it really drives me nuts, like on a laptop screen or something where like, like the pixels are like right now I'm on like this gigantic screen and the pixels are really big, but yeah, laptop screens, it's like that little
Mhm.
precision. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I mostly do all my LabVIEW in VMs. I don't even have LabVIEW installed on my like physical computer. And so when I'm in the VM, sometimes the display resolution gets a little wonky, and it makes it challenging.
Yeah, that can also, yeah, that can definitely mix things up. Yeah, I do the same thing. I have VMs too. So
I'm gonna have to get a different kind of mouse. I think I want to try one of those weird mice, since
get
in the
the
LabVIEW world you got a lot of clicking.
a Voluent vertical mouse is my favorite.
Okay.
Quite nice. I like it. It's supposed to, yeah, it's supposed to be very ergonomic. But your hand sits upright, but it's the most comfortable thing ever. So
All right, I'll
I
try
don't
it.
think it will make a difference, but it is $100 mouse, but totally worth it.
Hey, when I'm clicking all day every day, it seems like
Yeah,
a good
that's what
investment.
I immediately made that decision. I was like, yeah, I'm doing this every day. Like, it makes sense to be comfortable. All right, well, it was a very good discussion. I quite enjoyed it. I think we covered a lot of very interesting ground. Hopefully, our listeners will find it very interesting. I know I did. So,
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sam. I've really enjoyed. Thank you for creating this space in the LabVIEW community to share. I've enjoyed a lot of the episodes I've listened to, and look forward to even more.
yeah, thank you. All
All right.
right, thanks. Bye.
This episode of the LabVIEW Experiment podcast is brought to you by ergonomic keyboards. Ergonomic keyboards. Isn't that nice? If you'd like to know Sam's recommendation, head on over to our blog and type in ergonomics to see what he thinks is best. You won't regret it, and neither will your wrists.